Good evening. South African time. I'm sure it is morning in Brazil. Thank you very much for inviting me to do a short presentation to you about internationalization and where we will be in the post COVID-19 period. I'll begin with the first question that you asked me around new perspectives, around the formats of teaching and learning, and I will, throughout this short little talk, integrate all the questions that you've asked instead of answering them one by one. Around the new format of teaching and learning, we've seen already in the South African environment that hybrid teaching, where online and face-to-face teaching is taking place. The current situation is, of course, that all our universities have moved online, as many universities throughout the world have done. The hybrid comes in that after this period, students will have to go back and do some of those exercises that they couldn't do online. I'm thinking of science students that need to be working in laboratories, medical students, law students who need to do their practicals in moot courts, etc. So the hybrid model of teaching I think is now being used, and I will later on talk a little bit more about that. It is not only happening where local students are involved. International students who are part of the South African and I'm sure global universities who's gone home, they are now currently also being taught online. The financial implications of this for universities will still have to be assessed. I know it's an expensive exercise, and we'll talk a little bit about the impact of this on the future budgetary situation of universities. But we also can't ignore the fact that the developed and the developing world is, although using the same methodology, have different problems, and the implications for them are different. Let me just say to you, in the South African sense, some universities have identified that most of the students, well, most would be 60%, could be serviced through an online mode. But 40% of the students either don't have access, or the bandwidth and data where they are don't allow them to do online teaching. So some of our universities have reverted to the old distance education mode of so-called learning by receiving material. That means correspondence teaching and learning. And it's thus this hybrid that they're also using in conveying or exercising the teaching and learning. All of this, colleagues, have been done in a short period, although as well planned as possible. We haven't seen the outcomes yet, and we cannot predict what would be the satisfaction levels, the pass rates, etc. What makes the problem in South Africa even more critical is that COVID-19 hit the university sector only 2.5 months into the new academic year. most of the universities in the US and other parts of Africa were actually at the end of the academic year and only had to manage to get to the end of April, beginning of May to finish the academic year. South Africa is far from that, and we don't know whether we will even be able to complete the current academic year. It'll be a major challenge, and we'll have to see what would be the situation when July, August happens. That's the beginning of our second semester. In the South African environment at the moment, everybody is locked down, so you can't leave your house. Students are all sent home. Teaching and learning only happens from faculty or academic staff's homes. We don't know when we will go back to university, to be able to enter the university campuses. Some predicts the end of July. I'm not so sure. I think the most optimistic would be for us the end of August, beginning of September. As we are going into winter, we do not know what the impact of the virus would be on our society. It is thus clear that universities will have to rethink and looking at different ways of teaching and learning, and the hybrid model that they are all implementing at the moment and experimenting with could become the standard way of teaching and learning for universities. Some of you might know that 2-3 years ago, South Africa went through the so-called fees must fall period. We were also nearly lost a year and had to go in a online mode. This is now the second time in 3 years, and I think we are all now looking at an environment where the world might become more and more unstable, unpredictable, and universities need to find ways to remain normal in abnormal environments. And that might mean that there will be a hybrid model throughout the year where the digitalization of the classroom would be implemented, and it could become a permanent feature of the universities. We already see that international students are, well, I wouldn't say demanding, but inquiring whether they could only do part of a semester in South Africa and do the rest online from home. The part that they would like to come to South Africa for a month or two would be to do the practical work, and the class work would happen thus at home. Whether that would become a real reality is still to be known, still to be seen. I'm not so sure that one can ignore this, not for the next 2-3 years. We know that the health, it's predicted that the virus would come in waves and go in waves until we find a permanent solution. It would thus be in the interest of universities to become flexible, and they need to change the way that they think about student learning on campus, and the hybrid model, as far as I'm concerned, would probably become the norm. But I do also think that we will see sharp differences between institutions in South Africa and elsewhere. Some will adapt and would probably become the real internationalized universities. Those who can't and can't implement the hybrid model would become very locally focused, where the number of international students would be less than 1%. We have seen this in any case in the South African environment, that over time, about 30-40% of South African universities have 7 to 10% international students, and the rest not more than 2% and even 1%. So the differentiation of levels of internationalization, I think, will become even more obvious, and universities will have to adapt accordingly. If we talk about the question around the number of international students, I do believe that mobility numbers will decline dramatically. I know Simon Marginson predicted a certain percentage drop. I'm not sure. I don't think we've got empirical evidence at the moment. Neither do we have modeling that we can use based on past events. But I do think that in the next few years the current situation will have a definite negative influence on student mobility. Why do I say this? There's already anecdotal evidence that international students were left to their own, to look after themselves, those who couldn't get back home. They are financially struggling. Just from a South African point of view, most international students went home because they come from neighboring countries. But there are many that couldn't, and they are destitute. As everything is closed, there's not a chance for them to even earn money through waitering or do what they normally would do. They rely on income from home. And as they come from countries like Zimbabwe and so forth, who is also in a financial trouble at the moment, it is a big problem for international students financially. And I do think that at the end of this, the numbers would drop, not only because of the academic and the experience in South Africa or in other parts of the world, but because of the financial situation that would actually influence the decision of students whether they can travel or not. I do believe that the impact of this will be coming to universities in different forms. Students who were registered for full degrees and have gone back home might want to transfer back to universities in their home country. And credentials recognition will most probably become the norm, and collaboration between universities globally will have to happen to assist these students not to lose a full year or 2 years, but that they could transfer back and complete their studies at home. I'm not only talking about South Africa, the international students that are leaving South Africa. There's a number of South African students that have returned from Europe, and I'm talking about degree-seeking students from Europe, from the US, Russia, and China. And I've heard that some of them don't want to go back. And South African universities will thus have to look at the credit transfer from those systems into our systems. Just the question around the challenges of the virtual approaches in a society where access to data is unequal. I said it before. It's a major challenge for the South African universities to reach all its students. They have started to innovate, as I said, through the old correspondence style of teaching, but it is too early to make a judgment. All I know is that there's an unequal access, and I do think that from a quality assurance point of view, the quality assurance practices of universities will now be scrutinized to make sure that the outcomes of the teaching and learning is at least at the same level that it was before, and that it can assure those from outside universities who are asking questions around the quality of the teaching and learning. Finally, the question about internationalization of higher education and what will be the new international mobility patterns. I think it's still too early to predict new international mobility patterns. All we know is it will not be the same. It's imperative that the in-depth research is initiated to understand the student sentiments. I can only suggest that collaborative research projects that is multinational is initiated between international higher education experts. The research center that I represent is developing a research project within the Southern African region to see whether we can find early indications on what would be the mobility patterns. Not only within Southern Africa, but also students leaving to study elsewhere. Would it continue, and so forth? Now, it would be beneficial if this research could be linked with other regions and with other colleagues to do empirical studies on student choice, and that we don't only rely on perceptions. I'm worried that we see all these webinars all over the place at the moment, and I haven't seen any real empirical data being fed into these spaces, and we're creating perceptions that's based on people's own interpretation of the situation and not really based on evidence. I know it's too early, but I do think we need to be quite circumspect in the way that we go about it. The last question around global learning and global citizens and new meanings. I do believe that the global learning, education and global citizen paradigm will have to be revisited. All countries in the past 8 weeks to 10 weeks have focused solely on national interests. We've seen the closing of borders. We've seen how countries actually played the national card, and it's not only the US, it's all over. In Europe, borders were closed. In Africa, about 80% of all borders are closed at the moment. We thus see that the national interest has been put first, and we as international educators need to ask ourselves, why is it that all the regional organizations, the EU, the African Union, the Southern African Development Community, the East African Community, they've gone silent, actually. Very little have been said. Now there's here and there a statement, but when the virus and the whole impact of the virus was at its height, global collaboration was actually quite absent. The nation state acted. Now we need to ask ourselves whether that will have hereafter an impact on internationalization. I am convinced that international educators will have to reimagine the way we practice internationalization. Especially the past 15 years when commodification of internationalization became actually the norm. I think we'll have to re-evaluate it. The whole notion of millions of students moving, mobility of millions of students, and the prediction that the 5 would become 8 million, I am convinced that would not be the case. The use of external providers and the way that they, through financial innovation, influence internationalization will also have to be, we will also have to reassess this. It might be time for another global dialogue, as the one that took place in 2014, where all role players were brought to the table. It was not only the associations, but there were ranking agents, development agencies, and so forth. So I do believe that there isn't an answer yet. We all need to find the answer. FAUBAI and other spaces like this, pity that the conference couldn't take place, but these would be the spaces that need to take the lead to include as many voices as possible to debate the future of higher education internationalization and to find a new way. Thank you for having me. I hope that everybody will have a good time in at least engaging digitally with each other, and that 2021 will be the time that we meet each other again in Brazil and other parts of the world. Thank you.